Thank you so much for the introduction, David. My name is Grant, and today I'm going to talk about some cool work that I've done while a research intern at Barracuda Networks, along with a host of wonderful colleagues and collaborators. Our work is looking at an emerging form of enterprise phishing. So typically when we think about enterprise phishing attacks, we have the following mental model in our heads. We have some external attacker who's trying to breach an organization or enterprise. And the way they'll do this is they'll send some deceptive phishing email to employees at the organization that's designed to trick the employee to perform some malicious action. And oftentimes we see in this attack that the attacker will masquerade as some sort of trustworthy or authoritative identity by spoofing or cleverly crafting some account. This is a very natural mental model for us to have, because if you look across the past 10 years of high-profile breaches, basically every attack has stemmed from one of these kinds of attack setups. Our work, however, is going to be different. Our work is ultimately going to push us to expand our understanding of enterprise phishing, both in terms of how we think about the attack and how we detect these attacks. And we call this new form of enterprise phishing lateral phishing. So in the lateral phishing attack, we are no longer dealing with an external attacker. The world, in fact, looks something like this. We're at an organization, and the attacker has managed to compromise an employee at the organization, or perhaps multiple employees. From this hijacked account, they are then going to send phishing emails to other employees at the organization, or perhaps even elsewhere. Now, this new setup is actually quite interesting, and it has a number of differentiating factors and challenges from external phishing. For one thing, both users and traditional anti-phishing systems have a problem detecting lateral phishing attacks. They're currently primed to expect inbound attacks from external attackers, not internal sources. So a lot of detection is based at the border, looking for malicious emails that we receive, and not for malicious emails that come from within. Somewhat related, a lot of current traditional anti-phishing techniques often search for signals of spoofing or forgery in the sender, because that's the predominant mode we've seen in these high-profile breaches. On the other hand, lateral phishing is not going to exhibit these signals, right? The attacker has compromised the legitimate account, and they're sending the attack from this legitimate account. So there is not going to be any spoofing or forgery on the sender metadata. Additionally, there are a number of interesting and unknown questions about lateral phishing attack strategies. So the attackers compromise a legitimate account, and they have access to the user's historical emails and relationships. So they have the potential to craft really targeted content against really specific users that are related to the account. Now, to what extent attackers actually do that is not well understood. And so to address these sort of unknown questions and challenges, our work takes two steps. First, we explored several different practical detection strategies for detecting lateral phishing attacks. And our work focuses on phishing attacks where there's a malicious URL included within the email. Second, given the attacks we detect, along with user-reported attacks, we have dozens of organizations that experience lateral phishing attacks. And from this data set, we can then try and understand the scale and different attacker strategies and characteristics of this new form of enterprise phishing. So to start off, let's sort of take a look at the data set we used. So this is a wonderful collaboration with Barracuda Networks, and in total, we were able to look at 7 months of data across 2018. 92 organizations comprised our study, so we had almost 100 real-world organizations that we were able to analyze and look at attacks that surfaced within them. A subset of these had known attacks, but the majority of them are sampled at random. And so we have dozens of organizations that are sort of a representative set of the general population. Now, across these organizations in time frame, we have over 110 million employee-sent emails. And for each email, we have a variety of metadata, as well as the actual text in the email. So with this really large real-world data set, the first thing we did is we set out to detect these kinds of attacks. We tried a number of different approaches, and you can read about them in our paper. I'm just going to give you a simple overview on the slide of one approach that was the most effective. So we trained a simple machine learning model. And what is interesting about our approach is that we think for lateral phishing attacks, it is actually most useful to train and apply this detector on sent emails. So traditionally, when we try and detect phishing attacks at an organization, we think about scanning received emails. But it's actually more useful, and you have a richer feature set if you apply this detector and features extraction on sent emails that come from within the organization. And so our features comprise 3 different categories. I'm just going to give you a high-level overview. Again, see the paper for specifics. One category of our features is what we call the lure set of features. And this is sort of text-based features that tries to ascertain whether there are fishy words or phrases contained within the email. The second set of features we extract are what we call the exploit features, and these ask the question and try and sort of calculate whether or not there's a malicious URL contained within the email. And finally, this third category of features sort of came from sampling a subset of reported phishing incidents. What we notice is that these phishing attacks are often sent to many users, and as a result, the recipients who receive this email actually don't usually receive the same kinds of emails together. And so this last category of features tries to sort of figure out whether or not the recipients of an email are sort of a weird set. And so with these three categories of features, we can then take emails that are benign and attacks from a few dozen organizations, train a classifier, and then apply this classifier on new employee sent emails from a bunch of different orgs. And by applying this classifier to sent emails, we actually found that given these features and this approach, we have a fairly effective sort of starting point detector. See our papers for the details on how we ensure soundness and evaluation. But basically, on a clean evaluation data set, what we did is we had attacks that were reported to us, which we used for training, that we manually analyzed according to a procedure in the paper, as well as emails flagged by our detector. And so ground truth is hard. We did the best we could, which was to manually analyze reported attacks and all the emails flagged by our detector, and then label them as false positives or actual lateral phishing attacks. So how do we do? Well, across 110 different incidents, our detector can find roughly 90% of them. And what's also interesting here is that there's a significant fraction, almost 50 incidents, which are not reported by users. So it's both high detection and it finds things that users can't report or don't identify as phishing. Additionally, our test data set has nearly 90 million emails in them. And how do we perform on that? Well, in terms of false positives, we do quite well. Less than 4 per every 1 million employees sent emails are flagged incorrectly as an attack. So overall, this approach does fairly well. Right? We find a lot of attacks, and we have few false positives. So given this data set of attacks, and given user-reported incidents, we can then aggregate them to understand interesting questions about lateral phishing at scale. So we have these 7 months of data. We aggregated all the attacks across user-reported incidents, as well as flagged by our detector. And in total, we identified 154 compromised enterprise accounts that were used to send lateral phishing attacks. And in total, these hijacked accounts sent phishing emails that spanned 180 unique phishing incidents. So conceptually, there can be multiple phishing emails if you have multiple recipients. They all sort of belong to the same sort of campaign or incident if they more or less contain the same content and are sent from the same sender. And so some of these are found by our detector. Others were reported by users. So with this data set of nearly 180 attacks that are in the real world conducted by real world attackers, there are a number of interesting questions we can answer. The first that we set out to answer in our paper is really how widespread and successful is this form of enterprise phishing? And the answer to us was actually that this attack is actually fairly prevalent and successful. Right? Across the randomly sampled organizations we studied, at least 1 in 7 of them suffered from at least one lateral phishing incident. In fact, the majority of the organizations in our data set suffered from 2 or more attacks. Moreover, using a very conservative methodology that we describe in the paper, over 10% of these attackers were able to successfully compromise at least one new employee account using this attack. So it's both successful and fairly prevalent. So that's one thing, but there are a number of other interesting questions we can ask about attacker strategy. For instance, what is the content? What are the messages that these attackers are crafting to convince their victims into performing some malicious action? Overall, when we analyzed the content of these messages, we sort of found that they fell into sort of 2 predominant narratives, 2 pretexts that were used to trick these victims. The first is this sort of notion that there's a problem with the recipient's account or computer, and if they just click on a link or download some attachment, that problem will go away. The second narrative that we saw, which was by far the most common, over 2/3 of our incidents, was this notion that there's some shared or new document with the recipient, and if they click on some attachment or they click on a link to some cloud file system, that they'll view this document. But in reality, that's a phishing document or a phishing web page they'll be led to. So these are kind of the storylines that these phishing messages use to trick the victim, but it doesn't quite yet tell us how specific and how tailored these messages are to the victim that's receiving them. So when we looked at the content of these messages, we found they fell into sort of 3 different categories. The first category is what we call generic phishing messages. And these are phishing messages that you would see by ordinary cyber criminals to any kind of user, not just enterprise. Right? So please view the documents I sent you. This was almost 2/3 of the incidents in our data set. The next category, which is still generic, but now slightly evolved to the enterprise context, it was about a third of our incidents. And so here's an example of that. It's the attacker telling the recipients that there's some updated work schedule that they need to see. So this is still fairly generic. You could see this at any enterprise, but it is sort of more evolved in the sense that it really only makes sense in a business context. So this is about 1/3 of our attacks. And then the last category, which is the most specific, the most spear fishy, was a little less than 10% of our attacks. And these are so specific that I can't really even give you too much detail. But basically, what happens is that the attacker refers to something very specific at the company, be it some item they use or a specific project. And so these attacks really only make sense in the context of the organization that's receiving them. They don't really make sense elsewhere. And so what's kind of interesting or fascinating to me is that the vast majority of attackers that we saw across dozens of organizations did not make the effort to actually write very targeted messages. It's kind of fascinating, right? These attackers have control over a hijacked account that's real. It has email history. It has these relationships with other accounts. And yet, for some reason or another, they decided they're not going to mine this content to develop really targeted content, really targeted messages. And so at this point, you might say, well, maybe these attackers are just lazy and unsophisticated cyber criminals. They're just not very good at doing things. We found that's actually not quite the case. We found sort of two behaviors that indicate that at least some of these attackers are investing some manual effort into the process. So at a high level, a lot of these attacks, and we describe this in the paper, are actually sent to several, if not many, recipients. And it is the case that these recipients will often reply to the attacks they receive. In fact, over 2/3 of the attackers in our data set received at least one reply from a human that wasn't an auto reply. And they take a variety of forms. So for instance, a lot of the replies that the attackers receive express some sort of skepticism over the email. Did you mean to send this to me? Or can you tell me more about what this document's about? On the other hand, there are some messages that indicate the victim's already fallen for the attack, even if they do express some skepticism. So for instance, this is an example of a recipient saying, hey, I logged in to view it, which presumably means they've already given their credentials to the phishing website, but I don't understand why you sent this to me. So what do the attackers do with this, right? They get these responses, and they can choose to ignore them. We saw that actually a significant fraction, a quarter of them, actually took the time to manually reply to the recipient's inquiries that they got. So they'd send this phishing email, the recipient would reply, and then the attacker would then in turn respond. So a quarter of our attackers did this, and we saw this across a fairly large number of organizations, 15 organizations in total. Now these responses by the attacker vary in their level of sophistication. Some of them were fairly generic, like, yes, have you checked this phishing email I sent you? Others were very elaborate, right? There was one attacker who was like, oh, it's a document about X, Y, and Z. It's fascinating. It's safe to open. You can view it by logging with your email and password. So these attackers actually are quite interesting to me, right? We saw that basically all of our attackers previously did not spend the time to develop this really targeted content. And yet at the same time, these attackers are clearly putting the effort to monitor the inbox and reply to their victims. So another interesting thing that we observed is that these attackers, they send these phishing emails from real accounts, and they receive replies to the phishing emails they send. But they're using this hijacked account that a real user is also simultaneously using. And so there's this question of whether or not the real user notices the attack and what the implications are for the attacker. And what we noticed is that roughly 1/5 of the attackers in our data set across sort of more than a dozen organizations actually put in the time to proactively delete and hide traces of their activity. So these are attackers that would go in and delete phishing emails right after they sent them. They would go to responses that they received and delete those responses, or any kind of phishing-related activity. So both users could simultaneously use the account, and the real user probably would never know. And it's also the case that about 1/3 of these attackers who are being stealthy also take the time to engage with their recipients. And so this is sort of a very interesting picture. We have attackers who are not really putting in the time to write very tailored and targeted content, yet at the same time they're willing to monitor the victim's inbox or the hijacked account's inbox to sort of interact to victims and then hide their activity. So at a high level, our paper goes over a lot of details. This talk is only a small segment of them. But overall, our paper looks at this new phenomenon that we call lateral phishing. And one of the key takeaways is that we need to sort of shift the way we think about enterprise phishing. There are all these breaches that come from external attackers. It is the case, though, that there's a significant amount of attacks that come from within the enterprise. And by shifting our detection to not just look at the border, not just look at emails we receive, but also ones that are sent by employees, we can protect A, our employees, but B, users at other organizations. And by looking at emails that are sent, that actually unlocks all these different features that are useful. And this attack is fairly widespread, right? 1 in 7 random organizations suffered from it, which was far larger than I actually expected. And we observed that these attackers are exhibiting interesting investment and time choices into how they're executing these attacks. They're not developing this targeted content, but at the same time, a significant fraction of them are willing to respond to victim inquiries as well as hide traces of the attack. So there are a ton of additional details in the paper. Right? We have all these different fancier detection strategies, which you can actually find in our extended report, which will be posted in the archive, as well as a ton of other interesting questions about attacker behavior. We didn't get to this in the talk, but I'm happy to take questions about them or read the paper for more details. So thank you so much for your time.
All right, questions?
Hi. Ariana Miriam from the University of California, San Diego. Great talk, and also congratulations again on the award.
Thank you.
I had a question about 2 of these statistics. So you said 7% of the emails were targeted, and then similarly, 19% of the attackers responded when the people they were trying to phish, had some confusion about the email, the phishing email. Were you able to look at what types of employees were the victims of these targeted emails, or the other case that I mentioned? So the reason I'm asking is because I'm wondering if employees that have higher status in the company or the ones that were the victims of the targeted email, or
Yeah, so that's a great question. 2 parts to that. So we didn't talk about this in the talk, but it is the case that most of these lateral phishing emails are actually kind of mass phishing. It's really interesting. So a lot of these emails will target dozens, if not hundreds of recipients, some of whom are at the organization, some of whom are elsewhere. So they're not just targeted to the CEO. It's not like specific lateral movement up the food chain. In terms of who's responding to the attacks, that we didn't do. We didn't have metadata about each employee's status or things like that, and so it's a little difficult to sort of go digging, and we didn't really Google people and stuff like that. So that's interesting for future work, and I think there's some literature out there, but we didn't look at that in our talk.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
From the front.
Hi, this is Yijun from Columbia University. So you deployed a classifier for about over 7 months, and I'm wondering if you observe something like the classifier's performance gets worse over time.
So I should caveat that this is a historical analysis. So we have historical emails, and then we applied this classifier on those historical emails. So it's not that so there is an active evasion. What we noticed is that we segmented our data set of 7 months into 3 months of training, 4 months of tests, and we withheld some organizations as well. And the classifier, this is in our paper, the performance on the training data set is basically the same as the performance on the test data set. So over time and over different organizations, the detector generalizes fairly well.
Thanks for explaining that. So I guess another way to phrase it is even for a passive analysis, I'm just wondering, like, for example, over 7 months, did you detect the same amount of attack across the same several months? Or do you detect less attack over time?
So that's a little harder to answer because the way we did this is our training data set has fewer organizations by setup than our test data set. So we trained on fewer organizations deliberately, and then we tested on later data. And this is sort of mirrors how you would develop a detector, right? You don't have all your organizations, and you don't get to see future data. So there are more attacks in our test data set later in time, but we also just have more organizations that we look at.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Okay. Hi, I'm Shruti from CMU. Really great work.
Thank you.
So how did you build the ground truth for the people who reported it if a lot of the attackers were stealthy? Like, I guess who reported it?
Yeah, so the reported attacks come from both users as well as organizations. Okay. So organizations will say, so there are attacks that are not reported by users, but the organization, after some incident response, has been like, oh, we have these phishing attacks. Okay. And they'll report them to Barracuda and say, hey, please make sure that we can detect these attacks in the future. So our reported data set is not just user reported, but also organization sort of security teams that report them.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, let's thank the speaker again.